Welcome to our second lesson, or rather open and connected discussion. Today we're going to be talking about diversity in the classroom and the connected classroom. And we're specifically going to be talking about how to design and conduct an online or even a hybrid course that will be a safe space for students, an open and equal place for learners of all kinds, and including the instructor. I think that's important. So I'm going to introduce myself and then introduce my two illustrious co-teachers with me. So my name is Lisa Nakamura. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan in the Department of American Cultures and Screen Arts and Cultures. And my research is on racism and sexism in video games and all kinds of multi-user environments. So I've been studying the internet since 1994. And there's one thing that's been a constant. There has been racism and sexism the whole time. So.
And I'm Liz Losh. I direct the Culture, Art, and Technology program at UC San Diego. Like Lisa, I've also done research on the internet and on gaming and different kinds of computer-mediated communication. I'm interested particularly in questions of access and inclusion. And I think one thing that's very important to be mindful of as we create these new digital environments for learning is as things become automated by machines, certain kinds of conversations can be automatically monitored and surveilled and sometimes blocked, so that it can be hard to have certain kinds of conversations. So, for example, filtering software at schools can make it difficult for young people to get certain kinds of information, particularly about sexuality, that might be important for them to be able to get. And also it's important to be mindful about how people are using mobile devices, and sometimes things other than the kind of conventional laptop or desktop that gets associated with education for some very important educational purposes. And so that.
Okay, I think Anne has her mic off, but she is going to be reading the Twitter and responding to it. So please tweet to #CCCourses, which is the Digital Media and Learning Project's dedicated Twitter hashtag. So if you're listening and there's something you want us to address or something you'd just like to add to the conversation, please do so, and you might get a response from Anne. She's a dean at the New School for Social Research in New York City, and as well an illustrious researcher in feminism and technology. And all three of us are working as part of a collective called FemTechNet, which is a group of scholars, activists, librarians, artists, teachers, learners, people who are working on feminism and all kinds of identities online. And many of us have been teaching with technology for a long time, and so everything that can go wrong has probably gone wrong for one of us at one time or another. So we have a wealth of experience about what not to do as well as what to do. So what will work in certain kinds of environments where we have students that we are responsible for as teachers. All right, when we bring people into the sandbox, which is the internet, we have to be mindful that there are consequences to being in public, and that sometimes being in public is pedagogically the right thing for us to do. Gives them a chance to learn and to interact, and that's the huge benefit. Other times it's not the right thing to do, and we should be mindful of keeping our students away from places where they can get in serious trouble, or where we can get in serious trouble, be harassed, be otherwise implicated in things, and in publics we don't want to be. So as teachers and as feminists, we want to protect our students, but we also want to teach them. And being in and around technology is how we teach in FemTechNet and how we learn. So if you're interested, you can go to femtechnet.org to see what we are doing as a collaborative group of researchers and what our students are doing with technology. So our students are constantly experimenting with technology, and so we have some great ideas for things that students can do that are feminist projects, but also just great projects for any student, such as wiki storming, right, which we're going to talk about in Lesson 3. So come back, Anne and Veronica Paredes at New School will talk about that. Okay. So I'm going to kick us off by talking about this idea the internet is a level playing field for students. and for instructors. So part of the mandate that FemTechNet took on was looking at how massively open online courses were proposed as ways to democratize classrooms by making it more accessible for students who couldn't get to a physical location, couldn't afford to pay traditional tuition, or for other reasons couldn't participate in face-to-face conversations around teaching. I think, though, as Liz's book, The War on Learning from MIT Press has shown, often online-only spaces disadvantage underprepared students. And these often are students who are also already excluded from all kinds of environments because of race, class, gender. So throwing students into an environment where they have to be very good and articulate and prepared writers and able to navigate new interfaces on their own is already a way that disadvantages or excludes the exact students that we think we're including. So we think about the internet as a race or class or gender blind space. That may be superficially true. When my students do their blogs, I tell them they can take on a pseudonymous identity because they opted to make the blogs public. This means I don't know sometimes who they are. So early on in the classroom, I say, send me a of what your WordPress name is because I don't know how to give you credit for your work. So it can be race, gender blind in that way. I don't know who my students are. But it can be extremely selective in terms of privileging students who are articulate writers who own certain kinds of equipment, say, and very exclusionary to people who don't, and that's not visible to us as teachers. We don't go into our students' homes or classrooms or dorms and see what they own and how they can use it.
Yeah, I mean, to follow up on that, there was a lot of language about the digital divide when a lot of us were getting started writing about learning and technology. And the picture that we have today is much more complicated when it comes to these gaps in participation. And access to particular kinds of platforms or infrastructures, it might be more invisible. So for example, one thing to be mindful of is that data plans can be very expensive on mobile phones. And many students who are first-gen college students depend on mobile phones as a way to access the internet and access different kinds of computer resources. But if they don't have a data plan, they might be much more limited in their ability to communicate with their fellow students. They might have a repurposed phone that they got from a family member, rather than something. The image of the one laptop per child. Not everybody has a laptop.
Yes, I think as well. We get so excited about things like video that let our students into the classroom or that let us be in the same space with them. But as we found when we were doing a big workshop over the summer, where we had many people joining in using our video conferencing technology, this often can produce and publicize class inequities in ways that students may not want to share. Students may not have private space. Mm-hmm. They may have to use a space that reveals a bed. Mm-hmm. We had somebody who video conferenced in who I think was in a bathroom, because the only good Wi-Fi signal in their home happened to be in the bathroom. And this was a friendly space, and we all were pretty warranted in knowing each other and why we were there. But it made me realize there are people who don't have private space and who might have to not be in those conversations because they can't find a reasonable location to have it in.
So those old questions about having a room of one's own that Virginia Woolf have raised, still continue to be very important in our technological age, because a lot of our students don't have a room of their own.
Yeah. So, well, as teachers, we want to do the newest and fastest and coolest thing, and I know video is less boring for the students and for you listening. It's something to look at. But, it does create a barrier and a visible reminder of who has access to private space and to professional-looking space and who doesn't. So that's something you might think about before forging ahead into things that, like video, which are cool and seem to create a lot of immediacy, but also reveal things about personal space around students. Okay.
And for a lot of our students who are working, they might depend on environments to get that wireless connection. And so they might be even more compromised in those situations.
Okay. So do we want to talk about other ways to make materials accessible that acknowledge that students have differences in income and ability and that kind of stuff?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the things to be particularly mindful of is how, there's this narrative about the digital generation, but it's important to realize that not everyone uses the same platforms, and that particular social media platforms often are used more by some groups than by others. And so, some students might suggest, hey, let's all use this platform, which is the thing that we use. And it might be, all of your upper middle class white students make this suggestion. And it's important to be mindful of the fact that there are there's a series of choices that go into patterns of platform use, and are entirely driven by a kind of free autonomous agency that's the kind of technological fantasy.
I don't do things with my students on Facebook. I
Me neither.
I tried it once, and they don't like it, and I totally understand why, right? Like there's a division between the public and the private, and they don't always want to let other students see all their stuff. Totally. But I've also had adventures in Twitter, and I know you have as well, where we have thought, okay, Twitter is de facto public. What's the harm in asking students to do something like fire up the Twitter in class and all tweet something about, say, their experience of diversity on their campus? So I did that once in a class on digital media, and it was in response to BBUM, hashtag BBUM, which was a really viral thing here at University of Michigan, and it was about the experiences of black students at the university. And it was perfect for Twitter. They were short, they were really kind of incisive comments about being black at University of Michigan. It means no one sits next to you on the first day of class, right? Or it means that people ask, are you from Detroit? Like these are really vivid kind of first-person stories about their experience, and so I asked the students all tweet to our hashtag for our class about an experience they'd had around race and diversity. And some of my students had well-developed Twitter personalities already, and some of the students had to make a Twitter that day. And so the students who had been tweeting for years and had lots and lots up there already were having to open up their Twitter lives to people they didn't know, right, which is other students in the class. And it never occurred to me that was going to be an issue. So I told them, you can delete your tweets for our class if you don't want people to know that you were called a name in your dorm, or if you don't want people to know that you had this experience around someone calling you, I don't know, fresh off the boat or something. And so they knew that, but that still meant the people who had tweeted a lot now had lots of surveillance of their Twitter by students, other students. So again, Twitter is public, but I had unknowingly directed attention to my tweeting students. And there was really nothing I could do about that until there's nothing to do about it. So now I've thought about that. I think Twitter is a powerful tool in class, but that does happen sometimes.
And certainly the ways that Twitter both functions at a particular moment in time, but also signals a whole lived history, can be really important to be mindful of. I know that in some of the experiments I've done with Twitter in large enrollment classes, some of which have gone spectacularly wrong, as I describe in the book, including a particularly a Diversity Day event that we had a guest who was talking about deaf culture on YouTube, where students actually orchestrated a collective coughing fit all at the same time, because they were like, hey, we can use this tool to coordinate with each other, peer-to-peer. How cool! But they weren't necessarily mindful of the fact that they had a guest, and they were, experiencing more levity because they had a guest. But when you have these students who might have a prior life, so for example, I had a student who was a power Twitter user who had lots and lots of followers. And the reason she had lots and lots of followers is she had lost a lot of weight, and she was very kind of concerned with this narrative about her weight loss story.
Mm-hmm.
But, this has nothing to do with the context in which she's tweeting for my class, right? So her followers who are following her because of they've been part of her weight loss story are confused when this other story, starts filling up the airspace.
So this is a great learning moment. If you're having your students blog, and we'll talk about safe blogging, you might them to write about what the drawbacks of Twitter might be for them. And if they agree as a class, hey, we all want to use Twitter, we're okay and comfortable with being invited into each other's Twitter lives, and maybe your class is small, I think you can let students decide on their own policies to some extent around how they want to use social media in your class. So they might want to do that. I've had students who were fine with it. But I would recommend having a conversation about it and building it into some of the class in the beginning, especially if you have a smaller class. So I think you can learn from our mistakes before you start to teach your class by doing some pretty basic things in trying to protect students' identities, making sure that the material they create for you and for each other can either be erased permanently or is only available fairly selectively, letting students have, if not anonymity, pseudonymity. I think I've learned that anonymity makes it impossible to grade. So it's really hard. I mean, as a principal, maybe we may want to do it, but as instructors, we really can't. We can't follow what our students are producing that way. So I think creating some time in your class curriculum to talk about the risks of learning online and seeing what they say is very valuable. It might not be what you think. My students use things like Tumblr in ways that I don't really understand. I don't use Tumblr, and so there's times we've used Tumblr in classes where one person will say, all right, I'll be in charge of the class Tumblr. And I think that's great. Partly it takes the part of the labor away from me and brings it into a peer environment for the students, and they feel more comfortable telling a peer, hey, I'd like you to change the settings or do it this way or that way, or I like this hashtag or I don't. But I think it also lets them have some experience of risk and reward. So if something goes wrong, they know why. If I curated an assignment using Tumblr or Twitter and something goes wrong, they don't necessarily know why because they weren't part of my process of setting it up. So they experience the downside, but they don't get any of the learning. And considering we're preparing people to be very much in the digital public, the value of failing is very important. So we just want to make sure they don't fail in ways that are permanent or really kind of damaging to them. So there are things we can do to prevent that from happening, and we're going to talk that, like really specific advice about how to design to keep students safer. So maybe we should talk about the safe space idea, because I don't know if everybody's familiar with that. We're kind of skipping ahead, but that's fine.
So in terms of feminist history and how feminists have thought about consciousness raising, the idea of safe space is an important starting point. So the idea is that the classroom or the consciousness raising space or the workshop is a space in which people can share information that maybe they've never shared before with a group of people who will protect the confidentiality of that discussion and who will also treat the speaker with respect and acceptance. It's interesting, though, that a lot of people who are working on social justice issues on campus, so people at women's centers or other LGBTQ centers, are also exploring this idea of brave space. So how do we create spaces in which people can test out advocacy positions, or how can they try to have audiences that they can model being more forceful about making people aware of injustices and bearing witness in a more kind of way. So, creating the right balance between spaces in which people feel accepted and cocooned, and spaces in which people can test out advocacy or assertion, that can be kind of a tricky thing pedagogically.
Yeah, we have a question from the audience which I want to address, which I think is a great question, which is, are there examples of using time-delimited kinds of online identities and accounts just for your class? And that's a great question, because sometimes your students will want to engage with each other and will have to engage with each other just online. Like if you're teaching an online-only course, or blogging is a huge part of your class. So I have a class that only meets once a week. And I am sure they forget everything about me and about each other if they don't have something to do. Like, it's just good pedagogy. They have to think about you at least twice a week, in one way or another. So having them do a blog when it's 3 days out from the teaching and 3 days before we meet again is a way to jog their memories and remind them to talk to each other. And so I've created WordPress blogs that are private, where we use real names, and I've had them do public where we use pseudonyms, and I tell them, do you want me to kill the blog at the end of class? Because I can easily delete this blog, but you are responsible for keeping everything you make if you want it. So I have not done a lot of blog aggregation, because that does give students their own control, right? And we've had other sessions on that, where it's their blog, they can desyndicate from it, or they can do what they want with it, right? They set their own permissions. But when I'm the person running the blog, and I almost always do, because my students don't know how to use WordPress, I set it up for them, and I'm the one who kind of makes it safe for them, and I tell them, if we want to go private, we'll go totally private, and if we want to go even privater, I will delete every single thing on June 1. But that means you really don't get mad if I delete your stuff, right? You have to have a plan in place for how you're going to keep it. So I think we get super excited about all the stuff our students are making and making an archive, but they are not super excited about having everyone read about their weight loss journey, or about having someone catcall them on the way to class, or even about being raped, which some students will write about, or just really personal things about, say, the experience of poverty at Research One University, which I've also had students write about. So if we're doing pedagogy that asks them to talk about identity, or even wants to acknowledge them as humans and not as machines, we have to make it possible for them to do that, but also make it possible for them to be private, and maybe to just not to be forgotten, right? So I think the right to be forgotten is a better known thing in Europe than it is here. But if students know you're going to delete everything, they are way different about how they write.
Yeah. Although some students have discovered the marvels of screen capture, which is one of the
to talk about in the first day of class.
Which is one thing that I've come to terms with when students have sometimes said regrettable things to each other and then have screen captured them for posterity.
Yeah, they don't call it the sandbox for no reason. People act like they're two sometimes.
Yeah, that's true. I think following up on these sort of practical suggestions about how to set up a class blog, another thing that we've talked a lot about in FemTechNet is avoiding the zero comments phenomena. So one of the things that you as an instructor might want to do is not only model how to blog, how to create a post, but also how to respond to posts. And I think you need to be able to kind of seed the environment so that students start responding to each other, and so it becomes really a true distributed set of communicative activities. because otherwise they don't really see online discourse as being situated with audiences that can respond.
Yeah, I want to add something to that, which is that it's a known fact that men get called on more in class. I even find myself doing it. They're bigger, their arms are longer, they sit near the front, they're just taking up a lot of space, and this happens in online teaching too. I have found that men's blogs get more comments.
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't monitor the distribution of attention in the class, often some women's blogs will have no comments on them, and sometimes it is because people feel uncomfortable because the content might be personal and they feel like men don't care about that stuff. But you got to protect your male students just the same as the female students. They have personal things they want to put up, and you have to, I think, make sure that female students don't get ignored, just like you would in your normal class. So to that end, as Liz was saying, you have to make sure that there is a good comment culture and they know what that means, that they make substantial comments for everyone. You might want to even engineer that and say, okay, people from A to L comment on this group, people from N to Z comment on this group, but also having students tell you on the first day what their preferred pronoun is for interaction online. So you don't want students commenting on each other's blogs with the wrong pronoun. That is a pretty microaggression, so I don't want to be too jargony. That makes them feel bad. So the word microaggression is often used to describe these moments where people just feel badly, but not for so long. Like they just feel badly. Like it's the opposite of the dopamine hit you get from checking your phone. It's the anti-dopamine hit. And if we enable students to do that to each other over and over, we're doing something bad in the classroom, which we could easily prevent. So maybe doing an initial blog post where you say, what's your preferred pronoun? What do you feel comfortable about sharing? Would you like this blog to be public or private? I actually think you should get that information before you even make the blog. But the pronoun thing might even change over the semester.
Yep.
So you should poll not just once, but check in the midterm and have a meta moment. Is the blog working for us? Or is our webinar working for us? Do you feel it's fair and open? Who doesn't feel listened to? And again, that's just good pedagogy, but it's easy to forget because you're wrangling with people's IP addresses and, the kind of minutia that you get bombarded with.
I don't know how to post a picture.
I know.
How to use the tags.
So the tech support side, that's important, but that tends to crowd out the other support side, which is the student support side. So, so I think, making pronouns something that students can control and you help enforce. So if students say, I want to be called they, and you see other students constantly commenting on she, you need to step in and say, all right, we made an agreement. We were going to use pronouns that we asked to have used for us. So again, another thing to do, but you will be surprised at how grateful students will be when you do this and how it will set a different tone in the online class.
And another thing to be mindful of is, and this is important for face-to-face classes as well, I think, one of the things to be mindful of is that the things you do to make a face-to-face class work are also the things that make online interactions work. And so just as being mindful of difference in any kind of design is important, being mindful of questions of difference is going to be important in these complex, messy times where we're integrating technology. And in addition to making sure that students communicate with you and with each other about pronoun preferences, also making sure that people don't assume what category of difference is meaningful to someone else. Visual presentation of a particular category of difference can be deceptive, and students may focus on particular identity positions that they think they see that might not necessarily be the identity position of the person in question.
Yeah, it's interesting when people get to choose avatars, like we have even chosen for our webinar. Some people choose a picture of themselves. Other people choose a picture of their animal or of an abstract photograph. And so I've seen online classes where students really want to see pictures of each other because they have a hard time connecting with each other and wanting to write comments for each other if they don't see pictures. But you have to permit students to withhold those kinds of data, even if other students want it, because there may be really good reasons people don't want pictures of themselves associated with with them in their classroom. We may think of the classroom as private, but it's true, as Liz was saying, there is screen capping. You have to assume that students are doing all kinds of things with the content in your class. There's no way to stop it, really. So finding some ground rules you can set from the beginning that will at least kind of prevent those problems before they can occur, I think is really important. Okay.
And I think being understanding about the fact that you sometimes can't control all the kinds of learning that happen, though. That there is formal learning that you're responsible for, and then there's informal learning that students might be doing amongst themselves, and trying to police that channel as well can be very counterproductive. So don't get in your students' business. In other words, you know.
Yeah, I do not let any of my students be my Facebook friend. I used to do it, especially with students who are closer to my own age. So returning women, they want to be a Facebook friend, I would say yes. And I have realized I can't do that because if I am having a bad day and I go into the classroom, or it's just not a good idea. And some people say, oh, after I grade them, I can be their Facebook friend. We're really friends. You can be really friends. But I don't recommend it because defriending is such a traumatic thing. So there's benefits to be gained, but I would overall say I wouldn't friend a student, not even a grad student actually. Even though they are peers to us intellectually and peers in many other ways, I don't go there. So if students come into your class and they really don't understand anything about why you're doing these things, there's lots of resources that you can send them to. So there's a great Tumblr called microaggressions.com that will help students get from the student perspective, right, from the young person's perspective, why you might not want to use certain kinds of pronouns, why you might not want to have pictures of people circulating around in semi-public space. There's also a really good Tumblr, and this is a great topic as well, having students bring in their own resources about diversity. Because there's so many great ones on Tumblr and other places. I think Tumblr is really known for being the social justice nexus. And a lot of our students know way more about that than us. So feminist pedagogy is often about letting students letting them share the expertise they already have. Because I'm from a different country. I'm from old person's country, right? And so I don't know exactly what their country is about, and they can tell me, and that will help me. So a lot of people use Tumblr really in strong and intelligent ways to learn about social justice. So there's one called racismschool.tumblr.com, which my students have told me about. There's some great lessons on there. One of them is called Racism 101. There's one called How to Be an Ally. Why it is that people get angry when they hear white students sometimes, say things about race and racism. And it's also about when not to be angry. So I've also taught a video which we have linked to our Connected Courses page called How to Tell People They Sound Racist by Jay Smooth, who is a DJ, New York DJ. And that's been very useful for students. I've shown it in class, and it teaches them how to call out the discourse but not the person.
Yeah.
Students will say racist and sexist things in your online class. I think I can guarantee that. It will happen. And classes things, it's just going to happen. Like if you have a successful class where discourse is happening, that will happen. And you have to decide how you're going to deal with that as the teacher. You can decide it didn't happen. I don't recommend that because I think that licenses it. It means it will happen more. You need to do something about it. So I think that can be a preemptive doing. I don't like it when people design courses where they have one day on diversity in digital, right? One day on feminism and sexism. That just the students don't respect that. You know, they see it for what it is. I mean, they see it the same way we see our ethics training as BS. So you have to find a way to make this serious and to build it into, ideally, everything you're doing in your class, and then they will just expect it. Like, they take their cue from you. If you just do it, if you talk about it every day, they'll understand. So this video takes 5 minutes to watch. It tends to be really easy to teach and very embodied because they can kind of practice it. So let's say, hey, let's divide up into groups. Why don't you say something that you think would be offensive and then recast it as not person-specific but speech-specific, right? And they like that. Like, it's kind of a role-playing thing, gives them something to do. And you can model that in online teaching. You can say, why don't you type a comment on someone's blog that models the wrong kind of speech, and then type another comment that models the right kind of speech. And then everyone can see it.
Now, we have a question from Twitter about how to deal with accessibility. So that can be very complicated because accessibility, that you can promote accessibility in ways that might have unanticipated consequences. So I teach a lot with YouTube, and when I have students who are deaf, the university creates transcripts of the YouTube videos. And the problem creating transcripts of some of these videos is sometimes the people in the videos they've created the videos for a particular community of people. So they might be creating that video, say, for other people who have mental illness, and that's really their audience. And, you know, I might say, this is an interesting opportunity for us to look at this as a class, but creating a transcript violates the privacy of the people who created the initial video.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
So I think the question of how to manage student-created content around accessibility is a really good question. It can be really instructive for students to learn about captioning, say. Mm-hmm. And at FemTechNet, we have learned that because we've made a lot of awesome online resources, videos, and dialogues with famous feminists like Anne and others. And we caption those because we realized if we were going to be an inclusive community for people, we couldn't assume everybody could understand what we were saying in that medium. And plus, it's just a good practice. It's part of making material. So that can be a project for students, which can be really amazing for them. Can kind of open their eyes to the labor around that and can also help them reach a bigger public. So I'm going to add something that's totally off our script, but I thought I would just address it because it's in relation to a question. The importance of failure. What to do when things do indeed go sideways in your online class. So a student is mortally insulted by another student or is harassed by someone who somehow found your blog, right, and found your public blog, even though the students are pseudonymous, now they're harassing your students. So I'm sure we've all had these experiences in this group of having something go really wrong, and how to teach students how to negotiate that. So, yeah, I'm trying to think of the importance of failure. It's really important, and when you think about it, your students have probably already been harassed online in one form or another. I teach gaming stuff, and so I have students who've played Xbox Call of Duty, and they put on the headset and they use their girl voice, their female voice, and everybody starts teabagging them or shooting them or calling them names, and they stop doing that. So that's something that people have often experienced already. Oh, people can't see me. So that's something you can build into the class, which is very productive. Right? You can ask them to write about experience of having been shamed or harassed or bullied online. I'm not saying this will prevent it from happening in the future, but if you're talking about digital interaction as part of the class, I think that's a great assignment. often students have no idea that their female peers are being treated this way.
Yeah, and there are also some good resources about that, particularly in light of some of the responses to Gamergate right now, and sort of general discussions of online harassment. And I think we're going to try to make a bibliography available to people so they can find more resources to explore these issues with their students.
Yeah, so if you're interested, you can go to hashtag Gamergate, one word, to see what's been going on around the harassment of women who criticize the culture of video games. And it's been a pretty hot topic recently for people studying games. I don't know if everybody knows about it, but it's pretty shocking how women are talked about often in those environments. So I think just as in an embodied class, if a student starts harassing another student, again, you cannot let that stand.
Right.
You have got to jump in immediately, because if you do let it stand, what you're saying is that this is an unsafe space, no one is paying attention, and you're on your own. And that's not the message you want to give. So even if your students get trolled or harassed by strangers, right, you do need to contact the student and say, I saw what happened. Maybe we couldn't prevent it. Let's talk about our commenting. Maybe we're going to shut off comments. I've done that, or no comments. But I noticed that happened to you, and tell me how you feel about it, right? I think we minimize online environments as not real harassment, but our students certainly do experience them as real, and maybe even as more frightening than in-person harassment, because that person can follow them across many platforms, right? So I've taught classes where I've had security guards sitting in the back of my class because I've had one student who was following another, literally, from room to room, and bothering them. I'm not saying we have to be the security guard in online classes, but we have to acknowledge that there is no security guard in online classes. That we kind of trust the platform to protect students, but the platform makes them more vulnerable in some ways than they were in an embodied class.
And certainly reaching very large potential audiences. So even in the case of very consciously safe spaces created in FemTechNet classes, we've had cases where students have ended up harassed for using different platforms to talk about feminist theory and ways that technology could be reimagined as being more feminist, including some of our really articulate, outspoken, confident students who were really treated as objects of ridicule and shame.
That's true. And what was, I think, really important about the response is that people got back to her that day.
Yes.
And said, I saw what happened. That was terrible. We can't undo it, but we're here and we support you. I think that's really important. Often just the acknowledgement that what happened to you was, in fact, egregious. Students are sometimes told, oh, just shake it off. It's just somebody being immature. It's not that big of a deal. They don't know you. They're not really a threat to you, but this is very dismissive.
Right.
And people who've been traumatized in the past and triggered by this are going to be re-triggered again. So the fact that it's happening online doesn't make it any different. I mean, you have to validate your students' experience.
And if anything, online identity can be even more real in the sense of reaching a very broad public. And so these things can be incredibly wounding and difficult and hard.
Yeah. Somebody asked if we should teach the students how to kill their own blogs.
Well, I think it's an important thing to engineer into certain kinds of classes, is giving students that ability. I had some money from Intel to look at what students got out of blogging long after the fact, and some students kept up their blogs for years.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And other students pulled the plug the minute that grades were in. And I think what's interesting is that I think both groups of students really learned something valuable about online identity. And in one case, students, nurtured an online identity that they wanted to maintain, and in another case, they tested out an online identity, got some feedback about it, and saw it as a provisional identity that they wanted not to maintain.
Mm-hmm.
And
it would be really easy to put a link in the class blog that points to how to kill your blog. I think we get so worried about making the blog, like getting preoccupied with making the blog, stoking it with content, making sure everybody participates, that we totally forget that these things need to be sunsetted, at least for some people. And that's part of the job of making for students, is giving them the right to opt out. So, this is very counterintuitive. Like, we want to be inclusive, we want people to be engaged, but letting them disengage is sometimes just as important as getting them to be involved in the first place.
Yeah, and it's interesting that sometimes the students, when I was at UC Irvine, we would give an award for the best multimodal composition that a student created in a given year in undergraduate writing classes. And it was interesting to see how many of the winners pulled the plug. Sometimes, they'd be nominated.
It breaks my heart, but it's a great story.
They'd be nominated by a professor. You got to look at this amazing online project my student did, and the student had already pulled the plug because the grade was in, and it's like yank.
Yeah, that's something that's really important to mention as well. I mean, some of us, I taught at a university early in my career where there was no research done, it was just teaching. All of our merit was based on teaching efficiency and productivity. And so we were really incentivized to gather every positive thing every student ever said about us, because we were making a case for our own salaries. So this incentivized people to have students do things that they could then put on their resumes for, this is why I deserve more money. So if a student does an awesome project in your online course, of course you want to point to it as your achievement. But you can't do that because A, it's not, and B, it's their content. And so this is hard for us because we are often asked to provide measures and assessments of our teaching abilities. So I think it's very good to talk about outcomes in ways that anonymize student content. We should do that. It's important for us to reward feminist pedagogy. And I think we also need to explain to our bosses that feminist pedagogy is not going to produce content that we can, say, put in the student brochure, right? So we're not factories for photographs of students, for brochures, or for websites. We're giving them privacy and space and safety, but that also means when we quantify what we did, we can't always claim those things. We can give students the right to opt in. I think that's really important. You may ask your students, do I have permission to point to what you did in my own work? And to frame it as that, this is my work, can I include you in it? Is a more inviting than to say, I need a raise. You did a great project, can I put it in my resume? So, viewing them as collaborators in that real sense, right? Can I link to what you did? Is very different from saying, can I use you as an example of my efficiency?
And I think the rhetorician Kathleen Yancey has done some great work on electronic portfolios. So a lot of campuses are super excited about electronic portfolios. It seems like such a great assessment tool, and it builds in all of this critical reflection, and isn't that grand? But the thing is that these again, it's a form of public identity. If the student isn't able to control the permanence of it, there can be a lot of unintended consequences. My favorite example to look at is I was looking at a list of exemplary electronic portfolios created by students, and there was a student who had, as the background of the electronic portfolio, had the stars and bars. Right, had the Confederate flag, which for many people is a really bad signifier to be associated with your public ethos. And the student hadn't clearly received any corrective feedback from a faculty member about why that's problematic for many, many audiences, and why it gets you read as a racist. And this was listed. This was supposed to be an exemplary portfolio. So I don't know. I think that if your institution is pushing for e-portfolios, point them to research by Kathleen Yancey, and know that there are potential downsides.
Yeah, we have a really good bibliography of resources for teachers who want to make sure they're doing it right on our website. I think Jameson just put that up. So it's on our connected course reading list, which I think is a great list. And these are very practical things from teachers who have done it right and done it wrong, like we have. So are there any you would recommend in particular, Liz? I mean, this is your bibliography. I haven't read all these things.
Well, I think in particular Jesse Daniels' Cyber Racism, White Supremacy Online and the New Attack on Civil Rights. Even though a lot of the focus is on very explicit hate speech, Daniels is really good at also dealing with the many forms in which racism can take in online environments, and ways to sort of think critically about it. You know, the classic A Rape in Cyberspace by Julian DeBell, I think still continues to be useful to look at, even though about an assault that took place in Lambda Mu in the 1990s. You know, so it's taking place in a text-only virtual environment. But I think some of the bystander effects that he describes are important ones to be mindful of, and that often as teachers we can be bystanders. We sort of assume that things will work themselves out, and we don't want to intervene. And as Lisa says, it's really important to realize that we have to advocate for students who are in vulnerable positions. I think Dana Boyd's work is really helpful. It's complicated work. It's important to realize that sometimes the cyberbullying narrative has a particular kind of it can reinforce a certain kind of paternalism that is also stifling to conversations and makes it harder for and also harder for people to register the importance of different categories of difference. So there are a lot of great resources here, and of course, all of Lisa's work is wonderful. Tressie McMillan Cottom's work on Twitter research, looking at the Black Twitter study from USC, is helpful. So if you're an instructor who wants to make generalizations about Black Twitter and are not part of that community of practice, there's some important reminders there. So check out this great bibliography. There's some good tools here.
Yeah, I think that there as well, there is really robust evidence that female professors are often rated as less competent in the classroom than male professors. That's just known. I don't think it's yet known whether this is true as well of online instruction. I think your students, even if they never see you in person, will make assumptions about your gender. And probably about your ethnicity as well, if you have a name that signifies that information. So my last name is Japanese American. I've found that I get an interesting response in the classroom. So as a woman, I think people don't necessarily believe everything I have to say about feminism. They think I'm biased. And they may not, as a woman, agree with everything I say about technology, but as an Asian, they think I know computers. So it is the most confusing thing for them ever, because these two stereotypes are at war with each other. They'll ask me about, like, oh, I'm trying to program something in Python. I'm sure you know how to do that. I'm like, actually, I don't know how to do that. But I appreciate the credit. Like, I think in ways. So being aware of your own subject position in the classroom vis-a-vis the stereotypes students will have about you, maybe as someone who's old and doesn't understand, say, how phones work, or as a woman who doesn't understand how programming works, and so if you screw up something on the blog, they may blame that on the idea that you're a woman. You have to kind of be prepared for that. I don't think it's a bad idea to throw up some slides that talk about stereotypes that students have about female and male instructors, or about instructors of color. So black instructors are twice as likely to be given critical comments given the exact same speech as white instructors. This has been proven many, many times. The stereotype issue is really an issue in the classroom. So we've talked mostly about ways to engineer platforms to make students safe, allow pseudonymity, allow ephemerality, allow people to get rid of their own content. Make sure students use the right pronouns for each other, or at least know how to use neutral pronouns. If they can't be bothered to remember, because your class might be big, tell them they is a better thing to use than he or she. These are not hard, they're pretty basic, but don't discount the notion that students are reacting to you in particular ways because of your identity, right? And again, it's not bad to remind them of the science around this, that they may not know it, they may not be aware of it, but this is how students react to teachers of different genders.
Yeah, so for example, often when you're not persuaded by these arguments, it can be helpful at the data mining study they did of performance evaluations and why women get the word abrasive. although it never, abrasive just doesn't appear in the evaluations of men. And similarly, sites like Rate My Professors professors also can end up feeling pretty wounded by some of these public attacks.
Don't read them. That's all I can say. I've had students give me unsolicited updates on my Rate Your Professor hotness scale. So don't read those things. Your students may bring them up as a way to flatter you, but I think as Liz is saying, yeah, like there's so much surveillance of teachers.
Yeah.
So as if it's not enough that we're getting surveilled by our bosses, by the public, by the students, I think there are ways we have to keep ourselves safe in online classes as well. And that's mine. Like I won't look at any of that stuff.
Probably for the best.
Yeah. So do we want to wrap up by giving some last bits of advice or wisdom from our own checkered past? I mean, rich experiences as teaching in online environments.
I think one of the most important things to do is make sure, if at all possible, having some equivalent of the office hour with the closed door.
Oh yeah, that's really important.
Because students want to give you context to help you understand important things about them that you might not otherwise know. And a lot have shame about particular things in their backgrounds, but you actually need to, it's very helpful sometimes to know those things in order to support them and support their development. And so, it can be very easy to get distracted by the bells and whistles of technology and not make sure that the old technology of a door that can be closed or a virtual door that can be closed so that a student can talk to you in complete confidence. Because sometimes they really need to tell you some difficult stuff. And not just obvious students of concern. Sometimes your best performing students need to talk to you about things that involve their feelings about how their identities and how they perform those identities.
I entirely agree. I think this is why online education, especially MOOCs, are so problematic to feminists. Is we can't do that sometimes in those spaces. And I know many people are teaching hundreds of students online, but it is worth the time to scan through and see who seems to be having trouble and just drop them a line. I would never give a student a cell phone number. I think that's too much. But giving some private time, I think, is really important. So I guess what I would say to finish up is that if you're teaching an open and connected course, you will screw up and the students will offend each other. And if you're not, it means you're not really doing it right because you're not ever engaging with things that probably matter to them, right? So if you're teaching math, cool. Like, that might not ever happen. But if you're teaching things about identity or about things that students experience in everyday life, it almost certainly will happen. And so feminist teachers have so much experience with managing these interpersonal dynamics in the classroom more than probably any other kind of teacher. Ethnic studies students have, professors have that as well. So my advice would be expect things to go wrong, just apologize. Just own up to it. Like, it should be amply clear to your students after day one that you are trying. So explain to them what you have done to, what you put in place to keep them safe, what you're striving for in the class. If it doesn't work out, just apologize. Own up to it. They know that you made the effort. I think that makes a huge difference in terms of their goodwill and trust in you, that you apologize immediately, take responsibility, make it clear what you tried to do to keep safe, and then just add what you learned into the next iteration. So my class gets better and better in that way every time, because sometimes I screw up and the students will tell me, next time make sure you don't do the blog that way, right? And then I don't. So this is encouragement to keep on making courses like this, and an acknowledgement that it's hard work and sometimes things will go wrong, but in the end I think we have to take these risks and make the classroom a safe space. I think we're done.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you for calling in or watching in. Bye.